that hospital costs have gone up since 2020, 119%. Far higher than any other part of our economy. So it's really clear that we have to get this under control because we want everyone to have access to affordable, quality healthcare. I'm going to turn it over to Hayden, who has been working on this for quite some time, and he's going to explain the corporate practice of medicine bill that we had. I was a chief sponsor in the Senate, but to be clear, the person who brought and crafted the bill was the chief sponsor, got it going, was Leader Ben Bowen. Thanks. I can stay for a little while.
Thanks, Senator. And thanks everyone for being here. Now I'm amongst friendly faces. I can talk just a little bit about the CPOM bill and sort of maybe the concept of corporate practice of medicine ban. Senator Patterson referenced this. So this is a doctrine that's been around actually since the 1800s in various ways. And we call it a doctrine because it actually originated in what's known as common law or judge-made law. Independent of statutes, state legislatures passing laws, courts often, and still do, but it's less frequent now, would articulate, rules like the law. And one of them was this concept of a ban on corporations practicing medicine. Sort of just like unlicensed lay persons, there was always a concern that lay corporate entities might not have the same interests as physicians and other trained medical professions to prioritize their patients. With corporations specifically, there might be a concern, as there is with many still today, that the primary objective might be to pursue profits and not what's in the best interest of their patients. So this concept has been around for a really long time. And you learn about it when I was in law school is when I first learned about this. And you learn about this concept of the state's bans on the corporate practice of medicine. And then you look around and you're like, wait, what? That still exists today? We look around and we see, the Optums of the world, we see private equity companies coming in and owning physician practices. So my sort of foray into this first started just writing about this from a scholarly perspective. We ran a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine with a couple co-authors, one of whom's a physician at OHSU, Jane Zhu, basically just setting out to try to answer this question. How is it, if states have these bans on the corporate practice of medicine, how is it that we're seeing such rampant corporatization of the medical sector or medical work or the medical, what should we call it, field? And I very much agree. These are the sort of commoditization of medicine is often just referred to as sort of another part of the economy. And we've been sort of inured to this concept that we just treat it like anything else. But what's interesting about this doctrine is that it's always sort of recognized that there's something different at stake when we're talking about, providing healthcare to patients. So we set out to sort of answer this question in this paper, asking, well, how is it that state bans on the corporate practice of medicine exist, and also we see such, as I said, such rampant corporatization of healthcare, not just hospitals, but increasingly as the Corvallis community is experienced acutely, as my community in Eugene, where I grew up and where I live now, is experiencing with Oregon Medical Clinic. We're seeing insurance conglomerates, retailers, Dollar General, Amazon, private equity, portfolio companies coming in and functionally owning practices. And there are a couple different explanations for why we see this. Again, why we see corporatization despite these laws. The big one is less actually that the laws have been eroded. As Senator Patterson said, Oregon on the books has a law that says, and this is sort of the way that this doctrine has been expressed in statute, essentially says if you want to own a for-profit, so set aside nonprofit, county health departments, community health centers, if you want to own a for-profit medical practice, it actually needs to be majority owned by physicians and other licensed medical providers. That's what the law in Oregon says. So the way that corporations have essentially done an end run around this is not actually by owning these practices. And this is what I think a lot of folks are familiar with now in Corvallis, we're familiar with in Eugene. For example, when Optum, quote unquote, buys the clinic, they're not actually buying the medical corporation. the owner of that corporation, that which typically a PC, a professional corporation, is a licensed physician, because it has to be. That's Oregon law. So Corvallis Clinic now, even though it feels like Optum owns them, they're actually owned by a licensed physician in the state. I'm not sure who that is. They're redacted on all the documents. In Eugene, I'm also not sure exactly who that is, but it's a licensed medical provider. Again, because the law says that it has to be. Lay corporations can't employ physicians and run practices. So then it begs the question, well, how is it functionally that Optum is running this practice, where this physician owner is essentially sort of a paper owner, or a captive physician, as it's sometimes referred to? And the answer is that these corporations essentially use the vehicle of what's known as a management services organization. So this is a vendor that provides services to a medical practice. So you have a physician practice down the road, they need help maybe with billing, or someone to help with back office stuff. So they contract with what's known as an MSO to provide those services. What these corporations have figured out through, smart corporate lawyers, is essentially they can use that vehicle of an MSO, which again traditionally just helps with your billing. They can actually use that that corporation, which can be lay owned, to essentially invert what is typically like a vendee-vendor relationship. The physicians and the physician practices owns the practice, and they have a vendor help them. They can actually use this vehicle to take control of the practice. And they do this through a number of basically contractual arrangements, where as an MSO, they subordinate the PC or the physician practice to them. And this is what's known as the PC MSO arrangement, or the friendly PC arrangement, when you actually have an MSO that's selecting the physician and installing them as that physician owner. So this is this sort of complicated arrangement that's been devised by corporations to get around these laws that say that corporations can't actually own the physician practice. So what the bill does is essentially, it would be in the first state in the nation to try to regulate this workaround, and to try to restore the spirit of the law. And again, the spirit of it, because it's still being complied with legally, but to restore the spirit of it to where the physician practice is functionally actually still in control. And insofar as they use MSOs and other vendors, they're using them to help the practice run, and not in the way that, for example, we saw in Eugene, where the MSO took control of the practice and basically got rid of all the physician leaders. So one of the things the bill does is it says the physician practice actually needs to retain control over hiring and firing. Those are the owners. One of the ways that we think that meaningful control of the practice is retained is making sure that they, as physician owners, actually are the ones deciding which physicians are hired and which are fired, not the MSO. So that's one example of many that we list out in the bill. I don't need to get into all of them now. One of many examples that we attempt to codify in the legislation, saying, here are the ways in which a physician practice needs to keep control and can't sort of relinquish control to an MSO. Again, to try to breathe life into this idea that physicians and other medical providers are actually supposed to be the owners of the practice, and these vendors are supposed to help them run the practice, but not actually be the owners. Yeah, of course, yes.
I just want to add thank you, because what you did was create a lot of jobs. What we saw in the Oregon Legislature was that there were a whole lot of new lobbyists who showed up. Lobbyists we had never seen before. Lobbyists who knew nothing about healthcare, who knew nothing about this bill, were reading the bill as they were talking to us, trying to talk us out of passing it. And so why do you think they're investing so much money in hiring lobbyists to fight this bill? Because it's coming back.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier there's an attempt in California right now through the courts actually to challenge this arrangement that I described. And I hope it makes some sort of sense. It's super complicated stuff. Took me about a year to wrap my head around what it is. There's an attempt in California right now by a physician group to challenge in court basically a private equity physician staffing company that's using this friendly PC model, where the staffing company Envision is hiring ER docs and essentially doing the same arrangement that I just described, where they're not actually the owner of the physician group, but functionally they are. Other than that, there's really nowhere else in the country that's trying to regulate this workaround. So I think what a lot of industry saw is that here's a bill in Oregon State Legislature that really strikes at the heart of the business model for some management services organizations that aren't really just in the business of providing a service to physician practices, but really need to have control over the physician. And again, we're talking about all sorts of contractual arrangements, some of which are quite explicitly just give the MSO the authority to tell the physician what they do with their equity. These are called stock transfer restriction agreements. So I think what we saw from industry is a concern that legislation like this, both in Oregon and then if it would proliferate to other states, and we are starting to see that. I hear from folks just directly all the time. And then we've also seen some bills introduced. We're actually about to see Senator Warren at the federal level introduce basically a version of the Oregon bill. She saw this and was like, oh, I'd like to basically introduce a similar concept, because as Senator Patterson referenced, they're seeing Steward Healthcare, a system in predominantly Massachusetts, sort of being ravaged by corporate interests. So I think what industry saw is a concern that this business model that everybody had sort of, I guess, just accepted at this point, this sort of workaround to corporate practice medicine bans, that there were some state legislatures who were interested in not getting rid of MSOs, not requiring that there's no lay corporate investment in healthcare, but being very specific about what this relationship is supposed to be, and that physician practices are supposed to be run by the folks who have a Hippocratic, who've sworn a Hippocratic oath to take care of their patients first. Those are the folks who we want in control of Oregon's healthcare system, and not corporations. So I think what they saw is what a one tool, just one, and there are many that could be deployed, to try to strike at sort of what I think we all sort of feel, everybody now feels, that the real power in the healthcare system is no longer with physicians and their patients. I think we all sense that in different ways. And it's really been decades of just basically relinquishing that power to large corporate entities and financial investors. And this was one attempt in Oregon, I think, to try to maybe take some of that back. And I think that's why you saw such vociferous opposition, and we'll see, what's to come when this gets reintroduced.
I think you also did some research into possible adverse outcomes did you have any data on if there's any difference between whether physicians are able to be in charge of the medical decisions, or whether the corporate ownership is more in charge of that?
Yeah, I think the most alarming evidence we're seeing now is probably with private equity owned companies. There's just across the healthcare field, whether we're talking about nursing homes, just sort of harrowing statistics, hospitals, physician practices across different specialties. There's a lot of emerging evidence that when these practices are taken over by, and again, not necessarily owned, but just functionally taken over by the MSO of a private equity-backed company, that you start to see sometimes a decrease in or at best, sort of no change in quality. But again, particularly in the institutional setting of skilled nursing facilities and hospitals, seeing real concerning decreases in quality, basically increases in preventable mortality, essentially because nurses they use fewer nurses to treat patients. So you see either worsening or unchanged quality, and then you see all sorts of tactics to drive up costs. Again, because sort of what you would expect with a particularly private equity owned company, the business model there is really to try to turn a profit back to investors really quickly. So these companies have to engage in all sorts of tactics to try to turn a profit. The classic model is actually being challenged by the FTC right now with a private equity roll-up on antitrust grounds in Texas, which I think is a good illustration of what you could see in Oregon if there's more private equity penetration. There, the FTC is challenging basically a serial roll-up is what it's called, of physician practices, where the private equity company essentially buys one practice and then tries to buy all of them in a region to aggregate negotiating power and then be able to charge higher prices. And you see that study after study shows with physician practices owned by private equity companies, you see this roll-up strategy used, again, to amass market power and then be able to negotiate higher prices without providing a better service, we're all used to this in the healthcare sector, just sort of size for size's sake, so you can charge higher prices. We've mentioned, it's the story of so many hospitals as well. So we see prices go up, unnecessary utilization go up. So again, when these private equity companies take control of the physicians, there are various ways that they can exercise control of the physicians, being like, we need you to do more visits because that's how we make money. Or we need, we're now gonna bill those visits in your name, and we now are gonna deploy a bunch of basically technicians who know how to code hire, so we can get more reimbursement for this. So just tactics to try to drive up revenue, and then it's particularly in settings where labor costs are high, again, like the hospital and nursing facility, then you just see sort of an accentuation of this, or an acceleration of this concept that the people who take care of us and our grandparents and are just budget line items. And to the extent that they can get rid of nurses to increase that margin, they're going to do so. And if that comes at the expense of, some more patients dying prematurely, well, that's just part of the business. And again, particularly in private equity, part of the business is also, and this gets back to the Stewart example, just an understanding that 2-3 out of these investments are just going to go into bankruptcy. It's, again, because this is the business model of just making an investment where you have a bunch of money pooled from private investors, and you're going to put a bunch of capital into different businesses, and you're going to expect that 2 or 3 of them fail and go into bankruptcy and restructuring. And because you load a bunch of debt onto them, all sorts of complicated ways that private equity operates. And that's just part of the business model. And it ends up turning a profit on net, because some of these companies you find a way to make them really profitable. But again, it forces this question as stewards collectively and legislators of our healthcare system. Do we want to be making gambles like this with our local physician practices and nursing facilities? And I think a lot of people intuitively are like, that's not sort of the financing model that I want my healthcare system running on. So, we're trying to do something about it.
Yeah.
You bet.
I know you have to leave soon, so.
I can say it.
Okay. You mentioned that this bill is coming back. And I wonder if you could say a little more about that. Coming back, what is it going to look like? And also timing and, for those people interested in speaking up and supporting, anyway, that sort of thing.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to mention was, actually I want to ask you a thought experiment in answer to your question.
Okay.
Do you know who owns each of the nursing homes here, long-term care facilities? Do you know who owns each of the clinics? And, obviously, who owns the hospital, the health system. Yeah, that's clear. But trying to find out who owns so many of these entities, it's so transparent. Like you said, that doctor's name was redacted in there. So one of the things you can do is take part in the work group that Representative Leader Bowman has put together. I'm going to ask Hayden to say a bit more about that. Also want to let you know that I'm here in Oregon, we've assembled a small group of people working as part of a national cohort on transparency in long-term care ownership. I'm on it with a representative from the governor's office, a couple of people from OHA, and someone from the legislative policy office. Will be reporting back later in the year on that to see if we can bring some legislation around transparency in at least knowing who owns things here. The second thing I wanted to add before I forget, because I'm getting older, is that I meet regularly every 2 weeks with the mayors of Salem, Independence, and Monmouth, and the firefighters often are sent to nursing homes over and over to pick up people who've fallen because they don't have enough staff.
Oh my.
And so the firefighters we're paying their tax dollars, sending them to for-profit long-term care facilities to pick up people over sometimes 3 times a day, same people, right? We need to require our healthcare facilities to be more responsible as a system, rather than just letting some parts of our economy siphon off wealth. Can you say a bit about the work group that Leader Bowman's put together and how people can participate if they would like to do that?
Yeah, so the work group that Leader Bowman is putting on this bill specifically, HB 4130. I don't know if it'll have a new number. next session. So that's being facilitated as we speak. I think they've had 2 meetings thus far, and it's open to anyone and everyone. I think mostly industry has been the ones, showing up and basically voicing their objections. But certainly everybody is welcome, certainly supporters as well. I think the best way I'll leave my contact, so certainly, and everybody knows, I can route anybody to that meeting group quickly, or if you go on Leader Bowman's website and find his email address, I think that's probably the easiest way to take part in these work groups. That I think there's going to be 6 of them. I think there's already been 2 over the course of, my guess, the summer. So the bill will be reintroduced next January is when the session is, right?
Yes, but, can I just?
Yeah.
We're supposed to drop bills by September 27th for them to be crafted. But the reason why it's a good idea for you to attend, one reason is you can hear the arguments of industry, right? And then you can craft your arguments when you come to testify. So I do encourage you to take them.
Yes, so absolutely. And Senator Patterson mentioned it, when this bill comes up next winter, it's going to be a real clash of patients and their physicians and other clinicians versus industry. And there's going to be a question, there's going to be obviously a lot of money thrown at Salem to try to pick off legislators and try to defeat the bill from, very well-heeled industry. And then it's going to be a question, I think, of how much we've organized across the state. Again, folks like all of us who are concerned about our healthcare system, clinicians who are concerned about the loss of power that they've experienced, to basically urge our representatives to support this legislation. So that can come in the forums like this, where you just organize and bring more people together, and then ensuring that your representatives are supportive of the bill. I think for this particular piece of legislation, physicians and other clinicians, I think, are very powerful spokespeople for this legislation, because they can speak acutely to sort of what it feels like to be controlled, to have their sort of profession, their livelihood, their calling controlled by Wall Street, essentially. So I think I've made a point in Eugene to really just tap into the physicians and other clinicians in the community to get a sense of how they're feeling. And so many of them just aren't familiar with engaging in the political process and feel in such interesting ways so powerless, and feel like they have lost all this power and don't have no way of sort of channeling it. I think they don't quite realize how effective they can be if they get involved in the political process. And again, for an issue like this specifically, how powerful voices of clinicians are. So I think, again, just in our respective communities, trying to bring folks together, especially where in places like Eugene and Corvallis, where there's been such acute events that everybody's sort of familiar with, you really can, go to the coffee shop or anywhere else and say, hey, the state, there's actually a group of folks that's trying to do something about this right now. Let's get involved. Senator Patterson could speak far more insightfully about what it means to get involved, but that would be my thoughts in terms of how folks can engage. I guess you didn't really even ask me that question, but I answered it.
I would just like to add that one of the things that we read on the record during the hearing was part of an email sent by a private equity firm to physician employees saying, go and testify, we've got to kill this bill. And so then after, and 90 people showed up we definitely couldn't hear 90 people in an hour and a half. We had to other bills a day or two. And that was why it got sent to rules, because their voices hadn't been heard. And it's true, they hadn't. I don't mean to roll my eyes. They hadn't been heard, but they hadn't showed up in the House. In the House, when the bill, it had strong bipartisan support. Legislators, both Republican and Democrat, stood up and spoke eloquently on the floor in favor of this bill. It passed with strong bipartisan support. But then when the powers that be that saw profit possibly loss, they told their physicians to go kill the bill. And after it died, because sine die was moved up 2 days. Let's be clear, that's why it died. They did get to leadership, but Ben Bowman is now leader in the House, my majority leader, so that's hopeful sign. We heard from many physicians who said, I was told to come and help kill this bill, but I want to tell you, I want to help you pass this bill, but I couldn't go on the record to say that, right? Because they were employed by a company, their employer was telling them to go kill the bill, but they personally felt that this bill should pass. So what Hayden said, providers' voices, healthcare providers' voices are so important. Please speak, even on behalf of those who want to speak, but will lose their jobs if they do.
An odd question, but how about retired providers? And how about future providers? We, in our organization, we have mostly retired folks, older folks who have the time to actually fight for causes. And then more recently, partly because of some work at the farmer's market and that sort of thing, we have a couple of young people who intend to be physicians or healthcare providers of some sort. Would those voices be important as well?
I'll just take a quick stab at the young voices. I was so annoyed to hear a lobbyist tell me, oh, we think this model of ownership by a management firm is so much better for doctors because young doctors, they come out with so much debt. Well, we as a state should deal with that. We shouldn't cause our students to have so much debt. But secondly, they don't want to deal with all these things. They don't want, it's like they need to be held, their hands need to be held, and they're not smart enough. I'm thinking, they're doctors. They're very smart people by definition, right? This patronizing thing that doctors all want this, it's kind of frightening. So I think I would put the passion of young people to work, let them speak for what they want, not the management firm telling them what they want. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think there's a couple interesting dynamics I think that have surfaced. One, I think there are a good number of physicians who have recognized that, all of us have made the decision over the last, this is like a 40-year trend where we basically made the decision, really the move to sort of managed care was the beginning of this, if we're being honest, of this sort of transfer of power that I've referenced a few times, where control in the healthcare system needs to be better managed not by physicians and patients, but by essentially corporate executives. So, starting really in the late 70s, we started to experiment with different models where we put large corporate entities more so in control of our healthcare system, first with HMOs, and then we saw the rise of big integrated hospital systems that increasingly a large number of them sort of conduct themselves like financial investors. And then most recently, this trend of big, publicly traded insurance companies like United or private equity companies getting in the business of managing practices. And the pitch is always what you hear is that we're the shrewd financial ones. We're going to come in, we're going to deal with everything financial. We're going to exploit economies of scale. We're going to make care coordination. We're going to make everything operate. There's very little evidence, if any, that any of this has come to fruition in all sorts of different contexts. The hospital is actually the best setting. We see very little evidence that huge vertically integrated hospital systems provide any better care. What they do is, have the ability to basically drive up prices. Where I'm going with this is I think a lot of physicians, we've all played a part in sort of changing how we devise our system and how we allocate power in our healthcare system. I think a lot of physicians are realizing that this bet wasn't a very good one. And the idea that we're going to relinquish control to financial investors essentially to take over and make all the decisions in a practice might be good if they do some things, which again, the bill retains, but it might, I think intuitively makes a lot of sense.
It's easier. So I just look, I think it's that they are giving us two days. One is yours, one is
Right,
ours.
and it didn't fit on the bench, so
Well,
I just.
but that, yeah, whatever. That wasn't, I don't think that was the issue, but so I think you should.
There we go. Is that you, Mike, or did they hear us? So I think that the physician angle is very interesting, and I think I'm sensing in the physicians I talk to a sort of a change in attitude where it's like, okay, we need to try to take this back, we need to try to take our profession back a little bit here. And then I think young physicians will see the same thing, and to the extent there are younger physicians wanting and willing to engage in this, I would absolutely support it. Obviously, retired physicians as well would be, you know, sort of more liberated, and I think this really does speak. The process of this is incredibly illuminating because you see how reluctant it sort of proves our point in the process. You see how reluctant currently employed physicians are to speak on this. And I've noticed this in Eugene. The things I've been told about what's happening at Oregon Medical Group, just because I'm from Eugene, I grew up there. I'm, you know, one person removed from basically every physician. That's where I got all my medical care growing up. Like, I have conversation, I know things about what's happened there that are significantly worse than what's been reported in the news. But physicians are just so worried about speaking out, even off the record, just anything to a news source, because they feel, again, like they are just, you know, an employee of a massive corporation that can bring lawyers and that can bring sort of retaliation. So they're reluctant to even say something about, you know, this disaster that's unfolding in Eugene, much less, you know, take a day off of work and go to Salem and talk. So I think the importance of physicians who are not employed is really great, because we're in a situation where so many currently employed physicians who are in this situation are just fearful of saying anything that they might, you know, lose their job. So it's a really interesting sort of dynamic that we see unfold as this bill tries to get pushed. It sort of is sort of laid bare.
Let's.
And I'm so sorry, I'm gonna need to slip out.
Okay.
Nice to see you again. And I
And
think
thank you so much.
you might be doing this at Eugene City Club, right? So Hayden might be speaking again at Eugene City Club.
Oh.
And so if folks want to tell their friends to come to that, that would be a good thing.
Okay.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for your work. Let's open it up for questions. We will take a couple questions from the floor here, and then we will switch over and take a couple of questions from online. And let's see, we may need, is there a microphone for? Yeah, okay, Alex has a mic. Okay, anybody want to, we've got a question in the back with David, and then Mike up front.
Yeah, I was thinking, if physicians really have control, part of having control is to be able to speak up and not have the MSO telling you you can't speak up. Would that be emphasized in the bill?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the provisions that in the bill would really circumscribe, almost ban certain restrictive covenants, like, so non-competes, first of all, non-compete agreements. Those are really pervasive with these MSOs, but also certain types of basically gag clauses that do try to prevent physicians from speaking. I think how I worded the language was basically, you can't restrict a physician you can't bind them to any sort of non-disclosure agreement when it comes to any terms that relate to sort of the nature and quality of care provided at the practice. So another example that we just inscribe in legislation, if we can get it passed, that says, you know, you can't gag physicians when it comes to something like this, because this is our healthcare system, and we very much want physicians to be able to say, something untoward is happening in this practice. I'm going to let the public know about it.
Thank you. I don't think this is working.
I can hear you.
It's working.
It's working.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, great. What I would like you to do is to connect this issue with the issue of having a universal healthcare system. How would having a universal healthcare system put an end to this, or would it have no impact at all? That's really the important connection I would like to see.
Yeah, so I think these two, So these two issues are deeply connected, and I think it gets back to this question of if we were to have a universal or a single payer type system, what would it look like? There's a version of this that we don't want. There's a version of a single payer system that's still run by corporate entities. And in fact, we're seeing this right now. The story at Corvallis and the story in Eugene, those are both fundamentally about a company whose profits are entirely predicated on Medicare. Not entirely, but predominantly. This whole game, the whole reason that United Healthcare wants to buy Corvallis Clinic, wants to buy Oregon Medical Group, is because that helps them make money in Medicare Advantage. This is the strategy. I could talk all your guys' ear off for way longer than you want to hear about all the different ways that owning a, yeah.
Yes, can you connect it, please?
Right, so one might say, and some people do, that this is sort of a single payer nightmare. These are Medicare companies. These are companies that operate within the Medicare program, taking over, being insurance companies, and then taking over the delivery system, United Healthcare. So in the type of universal healthcare that we all want to see is not this version, obviously. So in that type of system where it was publicly financed, we had, one or some coordinated version of the payers, of the insurers. We would want a law, I think, like we're trying to push here, that the practices, the medical providers, are owned by the community or by physicians. You wouldn't have to have that. You could say this is a universal healthcare system where all the physicians are owned by Amazon. That could conceivably be single payer. I don't think that's the one we all want. So these questions still have to get answered, even if we move to a system where we got rid of, the employee insurance system or private insurance systems. We still have to think really hard about how we're structuring the provider side of our healthcare system. These are all sorts of questions that haven't been answered. One, there's the financing questions about how exactly we do it, but there's also the ownership question. Are our clinical practices owned by communities? Are they owned by the public? Are they owned by physicians? Or are they owned by Optum? All those things could conceivably fall within, some sort of label of universal healthcare. But some of them, I think, for all of us would be much more desirable than others. So this question doesn't go away if we were to move to a system that was sort of had unified financing. It would, we would limit the extent to which this issue, I think, is manifesting itself if we got rid of Medicare Advantage tomorrow, which we should. But fundamentally, this question of sort of how the provider side of our healthcare system is structured and who is in ownership and control of it doesn't magically sort of get answered if we move to a single payer system. That's all part of figuring out what that publicly financed universal single payer system looks like. Does that help answer it all, or am I still not connecting quite the dots?
It doesn't really.
Okay. Maybe can someone?
At all,
Okay.
because we had
Mike.
But we need to move on.
Or maybe someone else can help.
We had a program here that came up with a good solution a couple of years ago. It had a good solution, and then this other stuff started up. I think this other stuff is a distraction, and it's a fear by the companies that the only way they're going to be able to continue to make money is by attaching themselves to Medicare. And that's what we need to fight.
Amen.
Yeah, I was just gonna interject, so wouldn't it
Needing the
remove,
microphone there.
wouldn't it remove the incentive for United Health Group if Oregon had a universal healthcare publicly funded, no more Medicare Advantage here in Oregon? So that would remove a lot of their incentive to want to continue to gobble up these medical practices, right?
Right?
I think it would, especially if it was correctly devised, but you can imagine other sorts of loopholes, incentives created depending on how you structure that system. You could still have Optum. At this point, United Healthcare, over half, far more of its revenue now is generated from its non-insurance business. So you could still be concerned, but I completely agree with you. If we didn't have Medicare Advantage here, we would be probably seeing less of this specific type of consolidation by insurance companies.
I want to, I want to give the folks online a chance. I imagine by now there's questions. And Narina, do you want to read one out for us?
Sure, Mark. Here's one from Robert Goldman. I assume this is directed to Hayden. This was back when the senator was here also, but does the speaker know if private equity organizations are using shadow banking off the books, funding sources to fund their ventures in healthcare?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the model's pretty well understood just with, there's enough money to go around with institutional investors. So you see a lot of private equity money pooled through, endowments of universities, public pension funds, and then just, really wealthy individuals. I'm not sure about the shadow banking, specific angle of that. Sorry.
Let's go ahead and tell them to. Narina, read us another one.
That is it.
Oh, okay. Mike Huntington had a question.
Thanks, Hayden, and Senator Patterson for mentioning the work group, and we'll look in on that. Are there other forms of rules making committees that we can also get involved in?
I don't know if there's anything else structured right now. I think the only kind of, only process through Salem is through Leader Bowman's office. Yeah, so there's gonna be, once this bill gets introduced again next, in January, it's gonna move through the committees on both chambers and all that. I don't think there's a current process being run. Are you thinking, is there an analog you're sort of thinking of? Do bills typically, you might know more than this than I do they typically have some sort of, like a work group put on by the committee? Is that what you're thinking, or?
Yeah, after a bill is passed, often there's a rules process that goes with it, which can turn the whole bill upside down.
Okay, I got it. So this bill didn't pass.
All right.
Yeah, so, but you're smart to bring that up. If it does next session, then yeah, all the sort of rulemaking that helps define exactly what the statute means is another area of political and industry contestation. It's interesting to think about, first gotta get the bill passed. It's interesting to think about what that might look like in this context. We try to be really prescriptive about exactly what the bill means to actually limit the amount that sort of definitions can be put into the bill after it's passed. So the intent here is to be pretty clear about what we're trying to do. But I think there's always a question of if there's rulemaking, what that might look like after passage of the bill, in what ways that this might be potentially scuttled. There's also I got a question the other day about whether, there'd be an attempt to take them out in court or take out the bill in court. I don't think that's a possibility for legislation like this. Folks here are probably aware that the related entity, the healthcare market oversight program in Oregon, which is a couple of years old now, and reviews all these transactions like they reviewed Corvallis Clinic. Our friendly hospitals tried to actually run to the courts and take out the bill, take out the healthcare market oversight program recently. So this was, again, a bill passed by the state legislators. The Hospital Association tried to go to court to basically invalidate the legislation, which was in my view, a really dirty tactic, and actually gives us, I think, all some insight in terms of hospitals, or at least the folks who represent them, sort of where their interests are. I think we all need to be very aware of what the hospitals are doing, because they went quite publicly right to the courts again and basically tried to take out a bill that our state legislators passed, that gives us all some sort of transparency into every healthcare transaction that happens. That's always a threat. So this didn't succeed, at least preliminarily, at the federal court in Oregon, in Portland the other day, just dismissed the hospital's attempts to do this. But that's always an attempt when legislation is passed, that industry is gonna basically try to say, oh, we lost here, let's go see if we can get a judge to invalidate this law. I don't see that as being a viable possibility if a bill like this were to pass.
Yeah, I have a question. So apparently Oregon Medical Group, where you're at, that there's a bunch of doctors. I've heard 35 doctors left the practice. So a lot of patients got letters that they're losing care. My understanding is, Optum, since it was before the healthcare market oversight was established, they had no control over it. My understanding is, I guess Optum was kind of guilted into saying they're not gonna hold to their non-compete clause, and that's the real issue, is the non-compete. And the doctors aren't allowed to practice there because of the non-compete clause. So I'm just wondering, since the Corvallis Clinic was exempted from review, is it gonna be the same thing here? Like, if we get a bunch of doctors leaving Corvallis Clinic, are we gonna have to rely on like a public shaming or something to keep doctors in the area?
Potentially, yeah. There are a lot of moving pieces on the non-compete front. In Eugene, yes, you're correct to say that I think Optum was publicly sort of shamed into basically saying they're not going to enforce their non-competes, which is only part of the problem. I think it's important to recognize that just barring non-competes wouldn't solve the sort of systemic issue we have here, where transaction after transaction, we see these corporations taking control of medical practices and doing things that, as a public, we probably aren't comfortable with. But the non-compete parts certainly played a role in Eugene. It also should be noted, it's hard to unwind. Like, I think this, a lot of physicians, knowing that they were on non-competes, like retired or they left the community. So I don't think we're going to see an influx of these 32 physicians coming back. I'd be surprised if we saw more than a couple, frankly, coming back to practice. But it's an important aspect of the ways that these corporations exercise control over physicians. It's one of the things that the HB 4130 would ban. Here in Corvallis, so a couple things are happening. One, at the federal level, the Federal Trade Commission actually just promulgated a rule essentially invalidating almost all non-compete across all sectors. And that would apply to a lot of physicians, although not all of them. There's important loopholes there. It looks like probably that won't apply in the nonprofit context. This has to do with sort of a jurisdictional fight over the FTC and the Department of Justice, how they split jurisdiction. And this rule came out of the Federal Trade Commission. So at nonprofit hospitals, it's not clear that physicians will be unbound from their non-competes. And then it's also unclear right now, actually, whether even in the for-profit context, whether all the non-competes will apply to physicians. And this hasn't been, I was actually just recently reading the rules on this. This hasn't been reported as much as I think it should be in the healthcare context. There's actually an exemption to this, again, the Federal Trade Commission rules. This is the federal rule. There's an exemption for when owners sell their practices that basically says you can still have, you can still enforce non-compete. So the concern here is that a lot of physicians, like at the Corvallis Clinic, I would guess, a lot of those physicians who aren't like the big owners still had some level of sort of equity stake in the practice. So what this rule from the Federal Trade Commission says is we're going to generally get rid of non-competes, but if the physicians have an ownership stake and are selling that ownership stake, then actually there would be non-competes could apply. So for the physician context, this is actually a super relevant exemption that needs to be that might curb how effective that rule would be. So then you have our legislation. I'll finish just super quickly. Then you have our legislation in Oregon that might pass come January, but not yet. So that leaves basically right now here in Corvallis at the Corvallis Clinic enforcement of non-competes. And yes, if physicians all start leaving, I've heard a couple more are about to. it will be up to the community and your state representatives to basically go to Optum and say, like, do you want to go through this whole thing again? Will you just basically tell these physicians that they can stay in the community and practice? And that might be as an effective strategy as ever. Again, these are like real lives in a real community. And we all have, access to our state representatives, to news outlets. This should all be happening as publicly as can be, and everybody should be seeing what's occurring and let the public decide whether they think Optum's making the right decision or for the physicians. So the long-winded answer to your question of will shaming be the route? For now, that's the one route actually that we have.
We're gonna go to an online question in 1 second, but I have the ultimate shaming phrase, and it's from the Bible, Timothy 6:10. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which, while some covet after, they have erred from the faith. You might want to write that at the bottom of your letters. Let's see, Norina, I think you've got another one.
Sure. Charlotte Maloney asks, how can we sign up for a work group before the session starts in January? And then we have a few comments in the chat as well. So that's the first question there.
Email Mike and we'll figure it out. That's the answer. Because he will email me and then I'll figure it out. I'll ask Leader Bowman's office what the best way to do that is. Does that work?
That works great, yeah. Mike has left the room, so we're easy in volunteering him. But behind his back, we call him the Energizer Bunny. So he'll take care of it. But do you want to read some of the comments?
Yeah, Charlotte also said update that some Eugene doctors are joining Oak Street Medical opening new clinic where OMG had office 18th on Pearl, opening in July. And then Robert Goldman posted, if anyone's interested, there's an article on Sage Publication, and Robert put a link into the chat and also thanked Hayden for answering the question earlier.
Yes, Alex.
Oh, Mike, go ahead. I asked the last one.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on.
One of the hospitals supported this bill. Any reason they should have? And the other question leading from that is, Doug Boyson, CEO here of Samaritan, I think is president of the Oregon Hospital Clinic Association. Seems to me we should talk with him.
Yes, on the second question, you absolutely should. I think every state representative should be in the face, frankly, of every hospital and hospital representative and ask them why they tried to go to the courts to take out a bill that we passed that gives us some sort of transparency into healthcare transactions. It's important to recognize that hospitals are often industry actors in today's healthcare system, just like insurance companies. So I think whether it's, I don't know Doug personally, I don't know anything specifically about Samaritan's system and where they are with the hospital association, but it's absolutely the case that the people that represent them decided to try to go to a judge and take out a law that was passed, and a law that is invaluably giving us all information into who owns and controls our healthcare system and when these transactions happen. So I think pressure from any and all angles on the hospitals to ask why they would do this is absolutely in order. I was just talking to Leader Bowman and actually asking him, they're gonna have, I think the hospitals testify at some legislative days coming up. And I said, where's the public pressure here? Why is this not publicly known that, again, you had our hospital association go and try to take out this bill through the courts? Your first question about why the hospitals were supportive of this bill also gets to why they deserve pressure for trying to take out HCMO. They got a giveaway here. This bill applies to physician practices in the community, not hospitals. That was a political decision made by and a policy decision made by Leader Bowman. This type of legislation gets a little bit trickier when we think about hospitals, which do employ a lot of physicians and probably should be able to employ physicians. But the same questions are coming up with a lot of of physicians in hospital settings, particularly, for example, at Peace Health in Eugene. There are a lot of physicians who are frankly aghast at Peace Health's conduct recently. They shut down, a couple months ago, they shut down our only emergency room in Eugene because that's where all the homeless people go. So that wasn't profitable. So they shut that down. So now we don't have an ER. Everyone has to go out to Riverbend. There are physicians who are really up in arms about why this decision was made with such sort of naked profit motives in mind, and who work at Peace Health and are, again, in a similar situation, are told by an executive how to practice medicine. So I think we're seeing similar issues arise. I'd be curious how physicians feel in local hospitals here. Similar issues arise in the hospital setting, especially hospitals that are beginning to operate more and more just like other for-profit entities, exercising a level of control over physicians that violates, basically their right to do so, as again, basically suits in the C-suite and not actually trained physicians. So I think there's a whole version of this type of legislation that could be applied in the hospital setting. That was not the endeavor undertaken by HB 4130. So hospitals really, sort of got a giveaway here.
They shouldn't have opposed it.
Sorry?
They should not have opposed it.
Yeah, I don't know if they, do you know which ones did?
I thought the hospital association did.
I don't think they did. I think they stayed neutral or even supported it. Yeah.
Well, who brought the lawsuit?
Oh, yeah, it's a
Sorry, we're
lawsuit.
talking about different things.
Yeah,
So,
no, it's the lawsuit I'm talking about.
oh, yeah. So, sorry. There's the HB 4130 we're talking about now, the corporate practice of medicine bill. That's different than what I was referencing in the lawsuit, which is the healthcare market oversight program, which has been in existence for a couple of years, which folks here are familiar with because that's the entity that reviewed the transaction. Again, before this bill, we all would have no idea that Optum bought that practice. Probably some of you would, but you have no authority to do anything about it. It's only because of this bill that it was even possible that that the state could actually reject it and say, no, this actually isn't good for the community. Obviously, we saw it happen where the Change Healthcare attack happened. They invoked the emergency exemption and basically got around it. This whole infrastructure would not have been in place 3 years ago. But the Hospital Association tried to take it out. They're about to try to consummate the largest merger in Oregon state history with OHSU buying Legacy. So you see why they don't want HCMO to exist. But they should, this should be known that this is what they're doing. Again, they're just acting like a business here, a business association, a trade association, trying to take out an entity that notifies the public when there's a healthcare transaction and undertakes a review asking whether this is in the interest of the people or just whether it's in the interest of the profits of these hospitals that are trying to get bigger. So that was my point you can see I'm exercised about this lawsuit. So you gave me the chance to say something about it, so I did.
David?
Yeah, I've had several conversations with Sarah Bartleby in HCMO, and they're saying, oh, we can't do anything more with that because it was emergency exemption. But one way there is still control over Corvallis Clinic and all the healthcare entities in the state is the cost care growth containment effort. And I don't know if they're looking specifically at hospitals. I spent 20 years doing this kind of stuff, but I would be looking at how much they're increasing the price of DRGs. They can group everything as a DRG, whether or not it's being paid that way, and whether there's upcoding on DRGs. And then with whatever powers that the cost containment program has, they should be able to come back on hospitals and go, you're really escalating costs and you're driving up the cost of healthcare in Oregon.
Yeah, so the question was about the healthcare cost containment program, I think it's called. This is a separate sort of regulatory program that I think is also relatively new. I would guess like 5 years maybe.
It's been in effect for 2 years.
Okay, just 2 years. And the goal here it was to basically bring stakeholders together, bring insurance companies, hospitals together, CCOs in the Medicaid program, and basically say, and there are folks here who probably know more about this program actually than I do. I have basically one potentially helpful comment in response to your question. But for the group, the intention here was to essentially try to bring together everybody operating the healthcare system to try to say, can we take hold of cost growth, which we all end up paying for in our premiums in the healthcare system? Again, sort of notoriously over the last number of decades, healthcare prices, particularly in the commercial market, so not in public programs where prices are set. We've seen the biggest driver of healthcare costs is prices. So different ways that hospitals, other providers, private equity groups that roll up hospitals can come in, get big, and basically just charge more for a given service. Very importantly, Americans don't overuse the healthcare system. We frankly never really have, but certainly for the last couple decades, there's been very little evidence that Americans use too much healthcare. It just costs a lot every time we use the healthcare system. So the unit prices are high. And as we all know in this room too, administrative costs are through the roof. So those are the distinctive features of America's healthcare system. Not that doctors prescribe too much or that we all go see too many physicians in services. It's that the prices are really high and we waste an ungodly amount of money administering the system. So those big drivers over the last few decades, particularly in the commercial market with prices going up, have been a huge driver of why we just continue to see healthcare just not be affordable. And this all shakes out in our premiums. So there was an attempt collectively to come together and say, hey, can we make sure that healthcare inflation doesn't grow beyond, I think it's like 3.4% per year. I think the major caveat here is I actually don't think that legislation, and anyone else can jump in here and knows better than I do. I don't think there's much statutory authority to actually do much about this.
I think they wrote in that, I mean, the first line of attack for egregious standards is shaming.
Yeah.
But then I think there's meat beyond shaming.
I think there are like tips, performance programs that, you know, the OHA can put them on. My understanding is that it's largely voluntary though. And the ability to actually sort of not like HCMO where HCMO could say, here's a transaction. No, you can just block it. I'm actually not sure there's much that the state has authority. This is what I've been told by the folks at Salem, like to actually do if you see, other than shaming, which is not nothing. And then again, the transparency of this is all good. It's all directionally, I think, good. But I do think I've been surprised to learn that there's actually not much enforcement here, which really at the end of the day is what matters. We've seen them exceed. I just saw a report, I think yesterday, that they've exceeded the target. The cost growth has gone beyond the 3.4%. Again, I don't think there's much that gets triggered to make sure that that's back at 3.4%.
Narina, is there anything more online? We're gonna wrap up soon here, but got anything that?
Just Marisabel just mentioned thank you to both speakers and all involved to share this critical information.
Thank you, Marisabel.
Good time for more questions?
Yeah.
Oh, one more. Mary just said cost containment is all volunteer.
Karen, is that your understanding too?
Yeah. And Alex has a question.
Just a quick question. It's really interesting to hear Patterson talk about the letters that went out. So that's what my question concerns is because I followed all the committee hearings and, you know, like Governor Kitzhaber gave a pretty eloquent speech and support. There was also a lot of fireworks because he mentioned the physicians that are being, you know, groups that were being backed, and there was a lot of there was some feelings going back and forth in there. So what I'm wondering about is what's going to be different. Is there some plan about what's going to be different this time? Because it seemed like for every heartfelt physician that stood up and supported the bill, there was somebody part of some group that was for, you know, I don't know what their backing was, but they were speaking against it. So there was a lot of physicians opposing the bill. So maybe it's more a question for Rep. Bowman and Senator Patterson, but what do you see is can be different this next time, because it almost gave the impression that, well, geez, if somebody didn't even know what they were looking at, they would think, well, half the doctors are support this and half the doctors are against it.
Yeah. I think probably a couple things will change. One, I think the hearing probably you're referencing had to do with, I think there was a lot of misinformation about the bill that made one particular management services organization, McKesson. So this is the one that McKesson is, I think, the second largest healthcare company in the country, owns US Oncology, which is a massive sort of Optum-like entity that here in Oregon, basically for independent oncologists, not all of them, but some in Eugene and in Portland, essentially owns the practice in a similar way. So they own the physical assets of the practice. They employ the non-clinicians. They sort of do everything as the MSO. And importantly, and this is a separate policy issue, but we should be thinking about conflicts of interest in the system. They're owned by McKesson, which is a massive wholesaler and GPO. So they basically buy drugs from manufacturers and sell them to practices. So we can think about whether we want a system where one of the big three GPOs is also owning practices, similar sort of conflicts of interest that we think about with United as an insurer and also owning practices. I digress on sort of that angle of this. Nonetheless, that became sort of a lightning rod, I think, of the hearing, was that these practices that use McKesson as their MSO were very concerned that they would basically be put out of business. I generally think this was a misreading of the legislation that hopefully will be ironed out over the course of the year. And I think there's less grounds for them to worry that, again, they will not be able to operate. As I said, this bill does not say MSOs can't exist, but it implements a number of protections to try to ensure that physicians are actually in control of their practices. So that's one sort of technical point. The other one is, I mean, so this bill, we all pay attention, but most people in Oregon don't pay attention to anything political, much less a discrete healthcare bill. But over the course of the year, I think it's probably going to be more so in the public eye. Most people hadn't heard of this concept of CPOM before it came up in this legislation, and we had a short 35-day session. We've seen basically after this bill ran, we've seen what's happened at the Corvallis Clinic. We then saw what's happened in Eugene. So I think there's going to be a lot more attention from people in communities that have experienced kind of what corporate ownership of physician practices look like. So yeah, that begs this question that we referenced earlier, is like, is industry and certain favorable, and there are a lot of physicians who make a ton of money off of these systems. So we shouldn't act like this is like a clean split between every physician wants this bill and it's just sort of corporate actors who don't. There's a reason a lot of physicians enter into these arrangements. They make a ton of money by selling their practices to these private equity investors. So it's absolutely the case that there are going to be some, physicians that are going to be deployed in opposition of the bill. The question is going to be, basically, just like any fight we undertake, I think all of us probably share similar politics in the political process. We're usually fighting industry in some way or the other, and they will have their folks. And then it's a question of how many people across Oregon, whether it's physicians or just people like us, who are concerned about our healthcare system and want, physician and patient control of it, how much we get involved. I could foresee a situation where there's more physicians and other folks in support than there were this time, again, because all this happened so quickly. We were very rapidly just trying to notify people of this. It happened so fast. So
Thank you.
To be determined.
Unless there is some pressing question, I think we're going to wrap up at this point. And thank you, Hayden. You've really educated us a great deal. And I imagine there are one or two people that would like to speak to you afterwards, if you can stick around for a few minutes. And even though she's not here, very special thanks to Senator Patterson. I'm ready to suggest she run for governor after watching her work in the Senate. I never expected to see anything go out unanimously from a subcommittee anymore in the world of politics. Thank you all very, very much. Our next meeting, which will be a more common style, will be, I believe is June 24th. But somewhere right around there is our, whatever the last month, the fourth Monday of June is. And thank you for being here. Thank you all. And thanks to everyone online, and thanks to Narina for managing the online. That was great.